Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of our On the Offense podcast. I am going to hold up a cup of coffee here, which I desperately need, not because, there's Jeff, not because I desperately need coffee, although I do, but because wind chill wise, outside here in Dallas, it is all of 1 degree today. It is 14 and 1 degree with wind chill. And so uh, not only do I need coffee, I need hot coffee. So we're very happy to be here with you. As you can see, we have a third party with us today, and we will introduce her in a moment. We are really, really excited about this edition of On the Offense. So, as you know, if you are a veteran listener, a viewer of ours, we always have some sort of news hook as to why we focus on a certain topic on a certain day. And that news hook this time is the fact that it is now earnings season. It is mid-February. I've already been on an earnings call this morning, and everyone is reporting not only the fourth quarter, but their full year earnings right now. So all things earnings are in the air. And that's the reason we're going to focus on that topic today. My partner in crime, Mr. Baum, who also holds up a hot cup of coffee, has he has multiple superpowers. One of them is financial communications. Having worked very closely with Jeff in a publicly traded company, he is by far the best financial communications person I have ever seen, before or since. And so Jeff's going to take the lead in interviewing our guest. And as for our guest, it is my absolute privilege, Smooch, to introduce Smooch Repovich Rosenberg. Smooch is one of the nation's leading, and probably maybe even the world's leading recruiters, both for corporate communications and for investor relations. So she sees things from all sides of the equation here. She is a published author. I have a signed book from her in my signed author book collection. Thank you for that, Smooch. And by the way, you came to my book signing in LA. And so we have signed books for one another, which is kind of cool. Smooch is very likely to you all out there a familiar face. She's done quite a bit of speaking engagements, lots of video work. She is one of the leading voices and faces in the business of recruiting high-level talent for both corporate comms and investor relations. She's the perfect person for us to have as our guest today. And honestly, I mean, Smooch is the person who brought Jeff and I together when she recruited us and several others to EDS 25 years ago this year, which is just amazing. Yeah, and we have continued to lean on her since as a mentor, certainly as a friend as well. And so, Smooch, we're so happy you're here. Thank you for joining us. And maybe before I turn it over to Jeff, Smooch, is there anything you'd like to say as part of an intro?
Well, thank you both, John and Jeff, for asking me to participate in this. As you mentioned, we've known each other 25 years, and it's been amazing for me to see the two of you just get catapulted in your careers and do so many interesting and diverse things with management teams. So it's a pleasure to be in the conversation with you.
Thank you. So happy this worked out. Jeff, I will turn it over to you to push forward.
Okay. And Smooch, again, thank you for joining us. Yeah, Smooch is pretty much a legend in her field, and we really appreciate not only her mentorship, but her friendship.
Thank you,
Okay,
Jeff.
so the way I think I'm going to do this is it'll be kind of a question and answer, a little modified, maybe a little humor thrown in. John has some props or whatever he may throw out there. That's his
Always
deal.
have a prop.
I might have brought a prop too, you just don't know. Anyway.
Well, I like it.
Okay, well, why don't I start off with a real easy one is what made you get into the profession? And what's your perspective on it? What makes you excited to come to work every morning and to recruit schmucks like us?
Well, I wouldn't put you two in that category, but I actually fell into recruiting when I was working for a global IR and PR agency in my 20s. I worked for a CEO who appreciated the business acumen and intellect I brought into, frankly, the marketing and communication space that I was working in. And when he was president of the U.S. operations, and when he was promoted to CEO, he asked me if I would start an executive search function for that firm,
Mm.
because in a professional service firm, talent is your biggest business challenge. Put profits and all of that aside, it's always in the talent. And so when he asked me to do that, I trusted his judgment that I was the right person to be in this field. And I just found that I loved it. I have been in search now about 35 years, and I feel as though I've gotten 250 MBAs because I've learned about so many companies, their business, their structure.
Yeah.
And I love people, and I enjoy helping professionals like yourselves be introduced to the right career opportunity, not just another job. And so I'm a little bit of the odd man in the profession, in that I really have always believed my loyalty has to be equal to the corporate clients and getting their needs met, and also to the talent and helping them to navigate their careers. And that's really the intersection of my passion.
That's
I don't
fantastic.
think I don't think I knew that, how you got into that. That's a great story. Didn't realize that.
I was very fortunate, John, working for a CEO who just saw in me qualities that don't always manifest themselves in the job you have today, if you will.
Mhm.
And he was the best CEO I've ever worked for.
It's fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
he had good judgment, clearly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
get a good person. Get a good person. Well, I guess moving from that, Smooch, like John had said, you recruited both of us to EDS as well as a bunch of other members of our team. Um, I was always a communications person with a pretty good financial acumen.
Mhm.
How important do you think that is for a PR person to have a full understanding of a corporate financial statements, the ability to communicate earnings, acquisitions, all of the above? How important is it to have a really well-rounded PR person with a good business knowledge?
Jeff, I think it's critical, and I've felt that way for 30 years. But 30 years ago, the communications profession wasn't ready to do that.
Mm.
And I think companies and management teams hadn't evolved enough about the topic of communications, financial communications, the investment community, and the importance of that. And today, I think it's critical that, frankly, if I was going to college today, if I was studying communications, I would do a minor in business and probably finance.
Mm.
I think it's really important. And there's so many resources in the marketplace that communicators can turn to. I mean, if finance is not that tough, it feels tough, but it
Right.
really isn't. I mean, as John knows, I studied broadcast journalism, and there's not one shred of finance in that, but a little intellectual curiosity, and knowing that your colleagues and your management team count on you to make smart judgment calls. You have to learn business.
Oh,
It's just
absolutely.
non-negotiable today.
Yeah, I think I kind of learned it all by osmosis, really. I was a journalism major.
Mm,
Um, and since coming into the corporate world, I was told, okay, you need to prepare the earnings releases. And
mm,
just through that process, and each one of those takes weeks and months, to prepare, because that's the ultimate announcement of the quarter, not only how
that's
you're
right.
doing financially, but what's driving your growth, or
You bet.
the opposite of that. So, no, I understand that fully. Just a little bit
Well,
on,
let me
yeah,
maybe
yeah, go
just
ahead.
add to that. And I'll say this, maybe easier for me to say this about Jeff Smith. You'll love this if you haven't heard this before. But when Jeff was running earnings at EDS, it's one thing to write the release and even maybe the remarks for the call, the Q&A.
Hmm.
How many questions weren't there over 200 questions?
Oh no, John, you really underestimated. It was over 300.
over
Over
300
300.
I mean, I saw this guy, first guy in the building, last guy to leave for weeks on end going into earnings. It is hardcore stuff. I mean, you're a CFO essentially expressing CFO things through communications.
John, you're absolutely right. And I think the really savvy management teams do not underestimate that. It is hard work. And, I think investor relations / financial communications or a chief communications officer, those roles, you're either all in or you're not. And I'm not a black and white person, but I do think that every word you choose and every comment that you make or you coach your management team members to make, it counts. You can't take it back, especially today with the internet and all of that. So you really have to be sharp and precise.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, I've certainly learned by doing on that. So you were talking about 30 years ago, which is just, it seems like yesterday, honestly. But when I was at Lucent, I was director of financial media relations. So if you look at that in the scope of being 30 years ago, that was pretty progressive, I
You
thought.
bet.
Is that a normal role you see out there, Smooch? Is that something that's coming into popularity or was it a rarity?
Well, back then, Jeff, I think it was a rarity. Today, the IR profession and communications professions have evolved tremendously. And I think that part of the answer to your question is it depends upon the structure at the company. It
Mhm.
depends upon people's backgrounds. It depends upon the CEO and CFO's wishes and comfort zones about where those responsibilities reside. I have always been a believer that a head of communications and a head of IR need to be in lockstep with each other and communicate because if you're head of IR or head of financial communications, you may be dealing with the media, but you have to have, you both know this, continuity of the brand and the messaging across everything external and internal. So I think companies today have become more savvy about that. The literal structure, I think, oftentimes depends upon who's in those functions and those roles and what management team sees as most effective.
I completely agree. That's really insightful. Yeah, I know and I hate to always point back to EDS, but I was there the longest. And by the end of my time there, I was in lockstep with our IR person. We were best friends.
Mhm.
Um, so anything we did, we made sure we coordinated with each other. And just if I look back over the course of my career, the things I've done, um, you know, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you can adapt to that pretty quickly. But it's the art
Yes.
of persuasion and the art
Mhm.
of, I like to call it sales enablement. Even when I wasn't in a corporate function, I was lobbying on Capitol Hill. It was always about selling your idea. And as a company, you really just have one set of ideas, and everybody has to agree on that. So
Mhm.
I think that's a really, really great point. Um,
And Jeff, let me add something to that I think a lot of people, management team executives, CFO, CEO, and others miss. And I think it's not necessarily valued as much by practitioners like yourself, the two of you, but the greater professions. And that is, I think the right talent, the top 20% of talent in IR and communications have the DNA and the innate ability to understand that number one, they have to have a neutral voice. And number two, they have to be able to work across an entire management team, whether it's head of HR, CFO, president of a division, it doesn't matter. They need to be educator, advisor. There's so many hats that these people wear. And so I think that's an important piece too. And those individuals who can do that and do it naturally, they end up evolving their careers to greater heights than those who are solely about, well, I'm head of communications, so I only deal at the corporate level.
yeah, yeah.
In fact, I had a client years ago who said to me that I was talking to the CEO conducting one of my due diligence meetings, and I said, what's the most important quality about your current head of IR and communications that you want to see in his successor? and it had nothing to do with technical competencies. This CEO said to me, the incumbent, he is gracious to everyone. He doesn't pass judgment. There are people across the enterprise who seek out his advice and counsel on topics that have nothing to do with what we pay him to do.
Interesting.
And the CEO said, that's when I knew I had the right DNA in that executive. And that's hard to do.
Interesting.
And let's face it, we all bring biases and prejudices to everything we do. But that neutral headset of, I'm here to serve, and I'm going to always use my best judgment to give you the best answer, not the answer you want to hear. Those are influencer traits.
What
Does that
a
make
what a
sense?
that's a great insight. I actually just wrote down a question which you kind of sort of just answered. What's the number one thing that you look for in a chief communications officer and or head of of IR? Sounds like it's business acumen, maturity, able to
Yeah.
be an advisor, right?
It is, John and Jeff. I have always focused for the last 3 decades on a couple of thoughts. One, technical competencies are what gets a candidate to our doorstep. I focus almost exclusively on intangible leadership attributes because at the end of the day, I say to the management teams that I work with, you're not going to make this decision on hiring a head of communications or IR based on technical competencies because they wouldn't have gotten to these levels if they
Mm,
didn't have those, number one. And number two, if they're missing a piece, you can supplement. That's the easy part. The intangible leadership attributes, they either align with your values of you as CEO, you as head of IR, the board chair, the head of HR, chief legal counsel, or they don't. You
mhm.
can't negotiate those. And so I do think that package of intangible leadership attributes is critical. And I don't think talent focuses enough on developing those skills along their career paths.
Oh, that's interesting. So how
Mhm.
do you, how do you do that then? Maybe they don't, you're probably right because we're all so busy just being so heads down trying to get things done every day, right? How do you develop those types of attributes along the
You
way?
know, I, John, it's a great question. And a person can take a lot of courses. And I think that people should, once a year, every other year, take a course on kind of, human capital and intangible
Mm,
leadership attributes. But I'll tell you the easiest and fastest way is learning through observation. We
mm.
all know intuitively, let's put narcissists to the side because that's a unique category of human behavior and headset.
Yeah, yeah.
We all know intuitively when we observe others what is good behavior and what's bad behavior, what's smart behavior and what's not. And so, especially in the younger years of your career, or even as you get to your, in your third and fourth decade of your career, learning through observation of how others negotiate, how they navigate politics, how they dress, how they
Mm,
articulate themselves.
mm,
It's right there to be absorbed if you're willing to absorb it. For example, my parents, they didn't go to college. They weren't in corporate jobs. And,
mhm.
my dad was all about figure out the success path and, good luck. I'll pay for college, but you're on your own. And the only thing I had was to observe others and be a really active, good listener and ask a lot of questions.
I think that's
So that's
super.
how you do that.
Boy, that's great insight. And by the way, Jeff, I have some bad news. Are you ready?
I don't know.
The, the,
I don't know.
the good news for the world, but the bad news for you is that Smooch, yes, is a fellow Trojan.
I don't hold that against her. And she's even got on Trojan color.
Well, there you
Yes.
go. There you
He
go.
is a proud graduate of the University of Southern California. And you can see the quality of people coming out of that school.
And of
Now,
course,
I,
you
I
could see
say bad
me,
news for Jeff because he
blue,
gets it.
white, Nittany
Nice.
Lion.
Very nice. Very nice.
yes,
I
I
say
like the
bad
Nittany
news.
Lions. What one of my favorite clients many years ago was the head of corporate affairs at McKesson, and he was a big ticket Nittany Lion. and I
Okay.
loved
Nice.
him as a client. So there you go. You're in
There
good
you go.
company.
I only
Okay.
say bad news for Jeff Smooch because he gets an earful about SC a little too often from me.
You know
Well,
what?
I
Just
made the
turn him
mistake
off,
of going
Jeff.
to the West Coast with
He's
John. And
he's surrounded.
he drags me onto the USC campus. Oh, I have this there, this, that, and
Yeah, in
posing
fact, right after we had lunch
Trojan
with you
guy.
in downtown LA in August,
Uh-huh.
we went directly to campus and I gave him a little mini tour.
Yeah, well, that
Or was that
campus is not
before
like
lunch?
when you and I were there. It is so different.
No, it's unbelievable. The place is unbelievable. It looks so good. Okay, Jeff, back to you.
Back to me. Back to me. Let's talk a little bit about the interchangeability of the jobs.
Mm.
Okay.
Would you see it harder for an IR person to become a communicator or vice versa?
That's a
Um,
great, yeah.
It is a great question, and both of you kind of coming up through the ranks of the communication side probably won't like my answer, but here's the honest truth. When I look at the larger uh, communications profession, because of oftentimes the lack of business acumen, it's easier to teach a head of investor relations who today has a finance background. 95% of their background is finance, and they will move on to CFO roles at some point. It's easier to teach them how to do communications than it is to take a communications leader and teach them how to interact with the investment community. And that's not for lack of intellectual prowess, but if I have to distill down for a client, what is the real root of communications? It's about great judgment.
mhm.
And a head of IR has to have great judgment because you're dealing with a company's books and numbers. Head of communications isn't necessarily going to have the financial acumen to go head to head with an investment community analyst on financial models, arm wrestling about competitor companies and their finances. And so that's where the difference lies. I don't think they're, at least today, interchangeable. Someday I hope they are. I've wished that for 30 years. But there's not as many communications people who fancy numbers as much as IR people, as finance people can make good judgment calls. Does that make sense?
It
Makes a lot of
does.
sense. Makes a
It
lot of
makes
sense.
perfect sense. I think it's just reality.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it is.
I'll kind of equate it back to an example we had. Where do you think EDS? Of course, we had a huge earnings miss one year, huge, and it was
Right.
hard to explain. And I think a lot of people in the analyst community um, were thinking, "Oh, this company is teetering on bankruptcy,"
Mhm.
when we weren't. And yeah, we didn't have a whole lot of cash on hand, but we certainly were a healthy company. We had like $60 billion of business under contract that was pretty
Mhm.
much guaranteed to us if we stayed the course. And I think that sometimes, and this is no indictment of the person who was leading IR at the time, I think sometimes people miss that and the nuances. And, that's the one thing I always tried to point out to folks. Well, do you think a company with over $60 billion in contracts that are already signed is in trouble? And that actually wasn't a terrible argument to make. And I think a lot of journalists fell back on that, thinking, oh, well, that pretty much makes sense. And I don't think that our finance and IR people really opened up to that, that, oh, well, that's just sales stuff. But it really was helpful in terms of explaining that to our beat reporters. Um, so I
But
would say
Jeff,
that's
but Jeff,
probably an objective.
let me interrupt you for a second because I think you were ahead of your time in terms of the judgment piece. And ahead of your time in terms of understanding, having the financial acumen to be able to see that. If I recall correctly, at the time that I placed you and John there, the IR function was rather dated. It wasn't progressive. It was just kind of locked in well,
Right.
here's
Yeah.
the facts of the numbers. It wasn't about what's the messaging that you wrap around that so that the external world understands it and it makes sense. And so I think that's an important piece for people to understand. Again, it goes back to judgment, having self-confidence to be able to say to a room of people, I'm not sure that's the road we should go down. So let's look through a different lens, which is
Yeah.
a lot of what I think you brought to that conversation.
I hope that's something I brought to the conversation. I know after that horrific day, we all sat down at a table and, our good friend Tom Mattia and John and I and a couple other leaders, and we formed this thing we called the 1725 Club, which
Yep.
was the stock price we closed at on that cataclysmic day. And
I love that.
yeah, it was terrible. Oh, probably it was the day after because we announced after the close of the market.
So,
Um,
so what was the stock before? How high was it before the drop?
well, it was at 40 something. I think we're at
It,
43 or 44.
the day
So
before. The day
the day
before.
before. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So
And then
that's
that's
go back 6 months, we were at 68, and go back 7 or 8 months, we were at 72. So that was a huge, huge fall. And my way of dealing it, at least in my feeble mind, was, hey, this company does some things really well. Let's take
mhm,
the emphasis off of financial and
mhm.
celebrate the business we're doing and the innovations we have and really cut off that conversation. And I think it helped. I think it helped. I
You
think when
bet.
the company eventually was sold to HP, we got a lot more for that company than maybe it was truly worth. And I think a lot of that came from the publicity that we drove and our ability to, I'm not going to say turn chicken whatever into chicken salad, but that's what we did. So hopefully, yeah,
But
we did bring value from that perspective.
But Jeff, knowing there's another example of knowing when to advise management to pivot the conversation.
Mhm.
They don't teach you that in business school. They really oftentimes don't teach you that in communication school. And those are again, learning through observation. Those are the moments where you have to be able to feel comfortable taking a bit of risk and saying, well, wait a minute. Why are we doing this when that makes more sense? Because you're right,
Mhm.
EDS was a great company, but the optics sometimes color and hide what's really the business is about. So I
Right.
think
Yeah.
that's another intangible leadership attribute is how do you take this and pivot it, not spin it, because that's a negative word, but pivot it where it makes good business sense.
Yep. Yep.
That's a perfect example of the old Groucho Marx line, right? I don't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member, right? So Club 1725 was
Club 1725 was pretty intense.
people
I
weren't
love
beating
that.
down the doors to become a member of that club, but I remember that actual meeting.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Nobody does, John. Nobody wants to be a part of that kind of club. But at the end of the day, the people in that club hopefully have the intellectual and emotional strength to drive out of that
good
club,
point.
right?
Hmm.
Good
And
point.
that's another intangible leadership attribute. You can't, people who are really great at what they do, they don't run when the time gets tough. And there's a lot of
No,
people who do that.
that's a really good point. Yeah, and then if you do, just think of the effect it has on things like employee engagement, morale, and et cetera, right? So yeah,
It
I
cascades
mean,
across the organization.
it really does. Yeah, no question. I've got one. So you've talked about what's the number one thing that you look for in a CCO and or a head of IR. Are there an What's the candidate pool like out there? Are there enough people out there who've got the chops to do these jobs?
That's always the multi-million dollar question, John. I personally don't feel that there are. I mean,
Oh, really?
I deal typically with the top 20% of
Hmm.
both professions. Now, in the percentage below, or is there great talent? Yes. I think where people as individuals navigate their careers, I think where they really get off track is somehow over the decades, people are still believing that they are holding the hope that they're going to be the number one and have that top job. And I remember vividly at an IR conference doing a presentation in front of about 200 people. And someone asked the question, kind of similar, a little bit different than yours, but from the candidate perspective of, you know, I want to be the number one and blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay, this is simple math. And you all are finance people, so let's go through this calculation. If there are 200 of you in this room and only 20% of you get to the top, the question I would be asking is the other 180 of you is what do I do with that? So
Mm.
if you're happy with your job, you like your boss, you're doing meaningful work, you like the company you work for, your paycheck clears every week, and you get to have time on the weekend with your friends and family, what's wrong with being number two? And
Nothing.
that's right, Jeff. And that goes back to kind of an affliction I think we have in the United States of get on the hamster wheel and just keep
Mm.
pedaling as hard and fast as possible in it. And we believe that if we don't get to that top level, we're not good enough. And I don't believe that because some people are meant to be the best number twos ever. They're never going to be number one. Their odds are slim, and that's okay. And that's okay. So find, if I was to advise candidates, I would say find your station in life. And it's okay if you're number two or number three. Or
Right.
if you work for a small cap, not a large cap. It's all okay.
Mhm.
That's kind of a
Boy,
sideways
that's
way of answering your question, John. But I mean, there's good talent. It's just the talent's not always visible because they can't be in the number one spot.
Yeah.
what a great answer. I mean, and by the way, if you're the number two or number three, it doesn't mean you don't have a big job necessarily,
That's
right?
right.
And
That's
and you're
exactly right.
right. I mean, the number one jobs for chief communications officers and or heads of IR, there is a price. There is a price to be
Yes.
paid. The
And
hamster
and
wheel
it's
is
it's a
expensive.
finite number. There's more jobs below the top spot than there are the top spot. And you bring up another good point, John, about, there's a price to be paid. Invariably, when I am doing presentations, and they're all interactive, I don't do the speaking, talking head thing anymore. Someone will raise their hand and say the following: I've been at my job for 9 months, and it's not what I thought it was going to be. And my immediate retort to them is, well, okay, whose mistake is that? Because you sound like you're blaming your CFO or your
Mm,
CEO.
mm,
And one of the dynamics that happens with talent, and it also sometimes can happen with the hiring executive, is everybody falls in love and they're enamored with each other. Nobody stops to ask the hard questions because out of the fear that they're not going to be loved anymore, they won't get the job or whatever. And then 9 months into it, they're in a job that they say, well, wait, a third of this is not what I thought it would be.
mm,
That's as much on the candidate's shoulders in responsibility as it is the hiring executive. When I'm involved, I do not let that dynamic happen. I make the executives interview their top two candidates 2 or 3 times because with every conversation, you learn different things. You get more
mm,
comfortable asking the hard questions. And I think that's something that I would encourage management teams as well as candidates to do more often because why would you want to take a job that ultimately you're not going to be happy in? And I say that with
mm.
also the adage that even in the top job, there's 10% of what your job responsibilities are that you're never going to like and get over it.
Get over
Right?
it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's the way life works. Nothing's
That's
Reality.
right.
perfect. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Back to
Um,
you, Jeff. Boy, this is
yeah,
good.
yeah. No, no,
This is gold, by the way. I mean, I'm really excited. I'm going to be really excited to see this when it goes live. This is great
Me too.
advice.
I
Good. Thank
It
I
you.
I
really is.
agree. Yeah,
This is
I agree with that. I don't have too much more for you, Smooch. I mean, you've been such a pleasure to deal with, and your insights are golden, I'll tell you. Um,
Thank you.
and sometimes you got to break the mold is something I've found as well. If you live in the way, well, that's the way it's always been done, you're ultimately going to fail. And
That's right.
I've actually taken a few courses. You talked about courses in leadership, and one of the courses I took was differentiating a leader from a manager. And those
Hmm.
managers, they can manage that assembly line really well. They can make those
Mhm.
products flow off on time, zero defects, anything you need. But leaders are different. They inspire people.
That's right.
Do what I do, not just what I say. And
Mhm.
they inspire people to, rise to new heights, to break the mold. And I think a lot of the things you just said point exactly to that. So I thank you for that counsel.
Sure. Well, let me just make one kind of closing comment that I think is really important for people in both professions to understand. I mean, you're right, John. You started this talking about we're in earnings season and not just reporting Q4, but year-end earnings. And there's a lot of headwinds, as we all know. We all read the media. A lot of headwinds right now. It's
Right.
not going to be an easy year. And I would encourage people, the more you kind of lean into the headwinds in terms of being a true partner to your management team on topics they're going to want to hear as well as topics they won't want to hear, and being that really strategic advisor, the better off you, your management team, and your companies will be. Remember something, the best, when I think about my clients over 35 years, the best clients always say to me, I do not want you to bring me people who are going to say yes to everything. I want a truth partner. And I think this year is going to be, and maybe the next couple of years, a true test on the leadership attributes of people in both professions about being a truth partner to their management teams. And I would encourage people to take the risk, because that's going to demonstrate to management and to your board that you're more well prepared to deal with headwinds. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what they want. That's what they're hiring for.
I just wrote that down. Truth partner. What a great term, right? It
Mhm.
encapsulates so many things, right? Um, that's
Maybe
good
that's
stuff.
John,
what we should have named
I
our
always say to my clients, it's easy to sign a contract with me, but you got to understand what you're getting into. And if you don't want a truth partner and someone who's going to say to you, you know what, Mr. or Ms. CFO, you're not thinking about this in as broad a manner as you should, or whatever the case might be, I'm not the right recruiter because I'm not going to be a yes person and I'm not going to check it off the box, off the list, and I'm not going to just throw you a bunch of average candidates for you to believe that I'm doing what you're paying me to do. That's not the way it works. And that has really, I think, over the years helped build a reputation for me that when someone asks me a question, they know I'm going to give them the right answer. And I say that to audiences, you may not like my answer, but you will always get the right answer. And I think that's important in these two professions that people remember is to have the courage to do that.
That's
Well,
terrific counsel.
if any of
Terrific.
you wonder why we wanted to have Smooch on this podcast, that last answer maybe encapsulated as much as anything. Smooch, thank you for taking the time. I don't want to miss my prop opportunity. So
Good.
Smooch knows what this is, but so uh, Jeff and I, Jeff from the East Coast, me from the West Coast, we go off to Texas in the summer, by the way. I don't know how you talked us into doing that. And at that point in the year 2000, it ended up being the second hottest summer on record for the state of Texas. Little did we know that before we got there.
Right.
And a few months later, Smooch checked in with me, a little post-mortem, right? How are things going? And I said, oh, it's going great, but I really miss the beach. You knew this was going to be a prop, didn't you? So I don't
Yes.
remember if you delivered it to me in person or if I got it in the mail, but all of a sudden, one day, I had with me, courtesy of Smooch, a plastic water bottle filled with Pacific Ocean water and sand from Santa Monica Beach. And I
Wow.
have kept it with me for 25 years. It
That's
has moved
amazing.
with me many times. And this is a reminder of where I'm from, which you never lose, even if you reload somewhere else, right?
True.
That's right.
And but it's also a reminder of you, Smooch. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
taking a chance on me back then, because otherwise, frankly, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. I never would have met Jeff. And thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time today. Jeff, any closing comments?
No, again,
I'm gonna
thank
jump
you.
in here for a second because I have seen that water bottle in every single office of yours since I was a sentient being. Hi, everybody.
Yes.
This is Caroline jumping in
Wow.
from post-production. That I had no idea that you were the one who gave him that water bottle. Oh
Yes.
my
Yeah.
God.
Courtesy
How
of my fellow Angelino, who is
I
not
love.
who is not today, I trust, sitting in 1 degree with wind chill. What's the temperature in LA today?
Probably going to be around 68, 70 and sunny.
Oh gosh, you might want to get a heavy coat out. That's terrible.
Terrible. Well,
Wow.
we're going to be in the 70s next week. You know, it's
go. There you
lower
go.
temperature right here.
Wow.
That's right, John. View the glasses half full, for heaven's sakes.
The
I mean,
glass is-
really. And Caroline, I knew what I was getting into when I recruited John from Orange County to Plano, Texas. So the least I could
Yes.
do was bring him a little memento of what he'd left behind, so he would feel like he's always got the beach with him.
It is a
Does.
prized possession and will always remain so. Jeff, can you do
Thank
a
you.
quick commercial for our social channels?
Yeah, absolutely. So remember, you're listening to Clients First Marketing and Communications, LLC. Visit our website if you wish. I think it's a nice little encapsulation of what we've done over our careers and how we can help you. And then finally, tune into our social channels, which are across all the main social networking platforms. With that, visit us again. I'm sure we'll be doing more podcasts. We're averaging about 2 a month, and I think we plan to continue to do that. John, any
So,
parting words of wisdom?
no, just stay warm, everyone. Smooch, thank you so much again. It has been an absolute privilege. And
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it. It's always fun for me to see the two of you, and you ask great questions, so it's easy.
all good. Bye, everybody. See
Bye,
you later.
everyone. Bye,
See ya.
Caroline.